Welcome back to the Sage Audio channel. Today we'll be answering the question, what is headroom for mastering? We'll be offering a concrete answer to how much headroom you need for mastering, as well as looking into some of the technical aspects of headroom and metering, so stick around for the full video. But first, if you're an artist, engineer, or producer, and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master that mix for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. All you gotta do is set up this short account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. Now, the first question that I want to answer when it comes to headroom is what measurement type you should be using for headroom. Now, typically when someone requests a certain amount of headroom for a master, the measurement that they're using is dB true peak. Now, headroom itself is the distance between the loudest peak in your signal, represented as a negative number, for example, negative 4.2 dB and 0 dB, or the absolute peak in a digital audio system. Now, dB true peak is a measurement that considers not just the peak of your signal, but the intersample peak. In other words, this measurement takes into account the amplitude of your signal in between digital samples in your audio signal. Now, using this measurement type is important for a couple of reasons. The first is that it gives you the most accurate depiction of the amplitude of your track. And the second is that intersample clipping distortion can occur in mixes if they're loud enough, even if a regular peak meter isn't showing clipping. Now, why should you be using this form of measurement, dB true peak, as opposed to something like RMS? Well, although RMS is a great form of measurement suited for a lot of applications, finding the average volume of your track via an RMS measurement doesn't account for potential peaking or overs. The RMS value will often be represented as a much lower number than dB true peak and doesn't really represent peaking. Now, RMS is best suited for finding the average loudness of a track, which can be helpful when mixing and mastering. Additionally, you can compare the RMS level of your track with the peak of your track to get a good idea of what the dynamic range is. But when it comes to determining the amount of headroom for a master, it's best to use dB true peak. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is why 0 dB is not enough headroom for a mastering session. Now, it's been claimed that so long as there isn't clipping occurring, then 0 dB is enough headroom for a mastering session. The idea being that so long as clipping distortion isn't present, a master can be turned down and then processed at that lower volume. Now, although there is a solid argument for why this may be, the truth is 0 dB isn't enough room for a mastering session to take place. There are some rare occasions in which a mastering engineer could alter the track without any issues, but these would be few and far between. The reason being, it's highly likely that a mix with this amount of headroom includes clipping and unwanted brick wall limiting. The odds are if your track is peaking at 0 dB, then you have intersample peaking. This causes mild but unwanted clipping distortion. Additionally, it's difficult to have your track peak at exactly 0 dB without the help of a limiter. But if a limiter is being used on the master output of a mix, then transients are being attenuated via a brick wall ceiling. Now, for many mastering engineers, this would be a highly undesirable trait for a mix to have, as it would hinder their processing and result in a subpar overall sound. So this brings us to our main question, which is how much headroom should you leave for mastering? Now, although the exact figure is up for debate, a good range for the amount of headroom to leave a mastering engineer is 3 dB to 6 dB. With this range established, you'll be giving a mastering engineer enough room to perform their processing while ensuring that no clipping distortion occurs. But what happens if you don't leave enough headroom for mastering? Well, if a track doesn't have enough headroom for a mastering session to take place, then a mastering engineer can simply turn it down using clean gain reduction. However, this isn't ideal. Ideally, the mix will have the proper amount of headroom for a mastering session. Now, besides the obvious reason of it being more convenient for the workflow of a mastering engineer, there is one lesser-known technical reason why it's better to have the correct amount of headroom from the beginning. Now, when a mastering engineer needs to digitally reduce the gain of a track to perform their mastering, they're in turn using less of the available bit depth of that recording. Now, without getting too into the technical semantics of bit depth, the bit depth of a recording determines the potential dynamic range of a track, as well as the accuracy with which samples can be assigned an amplitude. Now, when you reduce the amplitude of a mix in order to master it, you don't reduce the bit depth, but you do reduce the number of bits that are being used. Now, this can introduce quantization distortion, which isn't significant, but it's distortion nonetheless. Granted, this isn't an incredibly significant issue, but these small things do add up to what can be a noticeable effect on the quality of your master. Now, the bigger issue is when limiters are used on a mix in order to create headroom. Now, sometimes in order to create an impressive mix, engineers will use brick wall limiting. Now, when this does happen, they'll increase the gain of the mix and reduce the ceiling in order to create a loud mix with headroom. But as we briefly discussed before, using a brick wall limiter means truncating your transients and reducing your dynamic range. Both of these things are not ideal. Instead of using a limiter to establish a powerful mix that has headroom, take the more arduous but better sounding route of applying compression where needed. Essentially, never use a limiter as a means to truncate your dynamics when mixing. Now, this brings us to our next point, which is how headroom and dynamics are closely related and relevant when preparing a mix for the mastering process. So, how do dynamics relate to headroom? The headroom of a mix exists only in relation to the maximum peak value of the signal. In other words, the room from the loudest peak to 0 dB is your headroom. Your dynamic range is the room from your quietest peak to your loudest peak. Now, this means that the two, dynamics and headroom, are inherently tied together. What they share is that they are both defined by the loudest peak of a signal. You can also define your dynamic range as the distance between your RMS level and your loudest peak, but still, the loudest peak is a defining factor. But why is this important? Well, although a decent amount of headroom is important, what's just as important is the dynamic range of your track. For example, if your loudest peak is -4 dB, but you only have 1 dB of headroom, a mastering engineer is going to need to work incredibly hard and in a creative way to restore the missing dynamics in your mix. In this example, although there's a decent amount of headroom, the dynamic range or lack thereof is a much more important issue. Now, the opposite of this particular problem can also present an issue for mastering engineers. That is, a mix that is too dynamic. If your mix is too dynamic, it most likely has a loud maximum peak to establish this dynamic range. Now, with that in mind, a fair amount of compression is going to be needed in order to tame any extreme or excessive peaks in a signal. When this occurs, compression will become noticeable, causing unwanted artifacts from that compression. All this to say that too dynamic of a mix can become just as big of a problem as a mix without dynamics. So, these are our thoughts on headroom for mastering, but what do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, if you're an artist or an engineer, send us one of your mixes at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. All you gotta do is set up this short account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. But thank you so much for watching. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and share this video with your friends. This way we know if you'd like to see more videos like this one. Also, you can subscribe to the channel. We release new videos every week, and subscribing is the best way to stay up to date. There's a comment section where you can leave your thoughts on this video or a suggestion for a future video. And again, if you're an artist or an engineer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.